and welcome to another episode of the Religious Studies Project. I'm Breann Fallon, and today with me I have
Dave McConaughey. We are rapidly approaching the end of our first season of content together, Bree, and I'm really thankful that today's episode is one that you recorded with Dr. Avril Alba about Holocaust museums as sacred secular space. So we're just going to go right into it today. Take it away.
Thanks, team. It's Bree here, and I am joined by Dr. Avril Alba. Avril is the Senior Lecturer in Holocaust Studies and Jewish Civilization, and she's also Chair of the Department of Hebrew, Biblical and Jewish Studies at the University of Sydney. She teaches and researches in the broad areas of Holocaust and modern Jewish history, with a focus on Jewish and Holocaust museums. Her monograph, The Holocaust Memorial Museum, Secular Sacred Space, was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2015. From 2002 to 2011, Avril was the Education Director at the Sydney Jewish Museum, where she also served as the Project Director and Curator for the permanent exhibition Culture and Continuity, which opened in 2009. She was also Project Director and Consulting Curator for the permanent exhibition The Holocaust, which opened in 2017, and she was Consulting Curator together with a team of academics on the permanent exhibition The Holocaust and Human Rights, which opened in 2018. She is the author of numerous book chapters and journal articles, and most recently co-edited Holocaust Memory and Racism in the Post-War World with Shirley Gilbert, which was published by Wayne State University Press in 2019. In 2018, she was awarded an ARC Discovery Grant to commence a major new research project, The Memory of the Holocaust in Australia. Welcome, Avril.
Thank you, Bree. It's great to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us in isolation from across the interwebs, even though we're not actually that far away from each other, but it is what it is at the moment. I'm really excited to talk to you today about the concept of the museum as a sacred space. That concept sort of came to light in the last decade or so. Can you give us some sense of how that area of study came to be and what its key concepts are?
Yes, absolutely. It's a pretty exciting area, I have to say. And as you say, it's probably a decade or a little over a decade old now. And there've been some really seminal works by people like Carolyn Dean and Crispin Payne and many others. And in fact, in 2017, there was this is for people who are interested in, doing more. There was a very comprehensive reader done, Religion in Museums, by Gretchen Bugein, I think is how you say it, Crispin Payne and Esperent Plate. So there's a sort of almost like now a bit of an explosion in the area, and it is a fascinating area. And in many ways, I think it comes from a central question, which is, to what extent do museum spaces, and I'm going to be broad in my definition here, so museum and memorial spaces, imitate and perhaps evoke the sacred? Now, this is, of course, a very big question, because in a sense it begs the other question of what is the sacred, right? And how do we define that? And how do we conceptualize that within spaces that traditionally really were not about the sacred? And if you think about the development of the museum form itself, it's very much a sort of Enlightenment project, right? The modern museum sort of grows out of the Enlightenment. I don't want to overstate that, however. I don't want to overstate that, because I actually, along with many others, have started to question that kind of narrative when we look at the development of museums more carefully. But I would say it's still fair to say that at its base, one would not automatically assume that, say, a social history museum or a science museum or places like that could also be places in which we experience and understand the sacred. But, as you say, with the growth of scholarship in this area and the growth of museums and memorials in general, we definitely, we are more and more, I think, thinking about those concepts and thinking about those places as places of the sacred. So, for example, I'm not going to, quote too much, but I do think this is a wonderful quotation from Jay Winter about First World War memorials, where he says, "They are the cathedrals of the 21st century, pointing to sacred themes of sacrifice, death, mourning, evil, brotherhood, dignity, transcendence." Right? And those concepts, those ideas, I think, do get embodied in these spaces. So I think in some ways the field is defined by questions like how do these places, as I said, imitate and evoke the sacred, but equally how do they desacralize objects that we considered sacred in other settings, right? There is the possibility of that as well. And then I think finally the most interesting question, certainly to me, is how do they transform our understanding of the sacred as well? And this happens obviously in a variety of ways. It's through looking at how religious objects and rituals become repurposed in the museum setting, the architecture of museum spaces and their contribution to the sense of sacrality. I think it's no exaggeration to say that for every architect today, the greatest job to get is a museum or memorial, commission, because the imagination that you can put into it and the ideas and the what you can do with a building like that is probably different to any other kind of building. And I think we can all think of sort of great museums and memorials and monuments that have been made in the last 20, 25 years. And it's such an incredible opportunity for architects in that way. And then I guess I would say on a sort of reception end in terms of these institutions, what I think is really interesting as well is how do they provide a space for what you might call ritualized behavior, right? What do they offer the visitor in terms of that kind of experience? Again, an obvious or a common experience is the kind of awe that one might feel in a cathedral setting. How is that perhaps mimicked in a memorial or museum setting? And people have done work on that, particularly with regard to art museums. But I think again, war memorials, Holocaust memorial museums, etc. They also do give that kind of feeling and purposefully, right, want to evoke awe, remembrance, mourning, etc. in the visitors that come. And for the visitors that come, that is a big part of the reason why they want to visit, right, is to go through those rituals of remembrance in those spaces. And then I think finally, and I think this is probably one of the most interesting developments in the field, is the relationship between these spaces and Indigenous cultures, right? And how Indigenous cultures are both communicating their sacred stories and places in these spaces. The very famous Seven Sisters, I think it was called, exhibition down in Canberra in the last couple of years was extraordinary, but also in many ways these places, I think, for Indigenous sacred ritual are very complex and very moving when one thinks about the terrible history of a lot of museums in terms of the robbing, basically the looting of Indigenous cultures and the looting of Indigenous bodies that was undertaken. And we know that a lot of the debates around repatriation today are actually about repatriation of bones, of bodies, and what is then the role of a memorial institution in that kind of sacred work. And we don't have to go very far in Australia to have an example of that, because of course we have groups within our Indigenous communities here who are advocating for something called a national resting place that may at some point in the future be built, perhaps in Canberra, perhaps it's unsettled at this point where that might be, but a place that is purpose built to receive back these peoples, their bones, and to have a place to respectfully keep them until they can be returned to their country. So, there are so many ways in which our institutions, I think, in terms of museums and memorials, both evoke but also really create sacred places for us.
There's something that you've raised there which actually brings a question to my mind, which is deviating from our plan. But I would like to ask you this question and throw it at you if that's okay.
Yeah.
This idea of creation of the sacred space, or the creation of the museum or the memorial. We were chatting the other day and you mentioned a new book coming out about how the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe commission process sort of occurred. And you mentioned a very interesting, I think it was a proposal for that memorial where an architect suggested that the memorial should just be to blow up the Brandenburg Gate.
Yes.
And I just was also thinking about, there's the new Holocaust memorial / museum in London that is being planned, and that's been littered with controversy about the experience of the person in entering that space, whether it was too experiential in that sort of memorial moment. And this sort of does lead me on to one of our questions, which is there something different about Holocaust memorials and museums? Is there something different about the way they approach the sacred or the way they are sacred?
Right. Yes. I mean, I do think so, yes, because of particular factors, right? There are, many, but the first is, I would say that even though most Holocaust memorials or memorial museums are not solely Jewish ventures, they are generally, either private-public partnerships, or a lot of the time they are publicly driven and government driven, as you say, particularly with the one in Britain. But they are, by virtue of obviously of the history they're dealing with, they are usually infused with Jewish memorial ritual, tropes, symbols, ideas, etc., etc. So by their very nature, and they function, of course, to allow for commemorative days that are both Jewish and non-Jewish in origin, right? So if you take our experience in Australia, we have Yom HaShoah, which is a part of the Jewish calendar, not the liturgical calendar, by the way, but the calendar in a sense sanctioned by the State of Israel. And then you also have January 27th, which is the UN Holocaust Remembrance Day. And we commemorate both in Sydney at the Sydney Jewish Museum. Now, how these commemorations proceed is then a fusion of traditional Jewish modes of remembrance, but also then obviously modes that can be translated or communicated to a broader audience. So they're always going to, in a sense, have that tension between, I would say, Jewish memorialization and broader memorialization. But within Jewish modes of memorialization themselves, that's where, to me, the real, I guess, and this is what the passion behind my book, that's where, to me, the real interest of the kind of sacred space we see with the Holocaust Memorial Museum occurs. Because in Jewish theology and in the Jewish world, there's absolutely no agreement. But in some ways, there's almost no other forum, I think, where one can sort of actively play out what it means to commemorate the Holocaust in the way that one can in a Holocaust Memorial Museum. And why do I say that? Because synagogues and cemeteries still have very set rituals that existed well before the Holocaust, and of course will exist well after. But the Holocaust, in so many ways, was it was a radical break for Jewish theology, and there is a whole realm of writing that we refer to as post-Holocaust theology, but it hasn't yet entered the, if you like, the sort of everyday liturgical life of the Jew. It has not done that. And what I contend is that actually happens more in a space like a Holocaust Memorial Museum. Now, I'm not saying that the that Jews and even non-Jews that come here come to those spaces are knowingly doing that, but they are in actuality doing that. And I guess I'll give you an example. One of the reasons I became really interested in this area, besides the fact that I have scholarly training in studies of religion and history, was that when I came to work at the Jewish Museum, it really struck me how for the survivors to come into the museum, to go to spaces like the Children's Memorial or the Sanctum of Remembrance was meaningful in the way that it might be for them to go and visit the grave of a relative. And of course, it makes sense because for the majority of those who lost people in the Holocaust, there are no graves, right? There are no places to go, but you need a place to go. There has to be somewhere where you can go and you can do that mourning. And what I noticed more and more for the survivors was that was the place they wanted to go to. And so I ended up actually, for my doctoral project, doing quite a lot of interviews with survivors on these topics. And they would say things to me like, for instance, no, it's not a traditional space, but it's a better space. And then I'd try and sort of push them on that. And they'd say, well, here I feel close to those I lost. Here I can think about them in a different way. Here I can commemorate. And that's interesting. Even the ones that had affiliations to synagogues or to cemeteries, this place had more significance for them in terms of that kind of commemorative, ritualized act. And so I think in many ways they are places, and particularly for people perhaps who are not religious, who are not observant, but in some way need to connect and mourn and feel that they have in some ways processed that history, whether they are connected to it personally or not. That is what these places actually allow for. And so, yes, I do feel like they perform that function. Now, that's not to say, of course, that wouldn't a similar function would not be performed for those who wish to mourn those they lost in other wars, in other places. But I think particularly within the Jewish tradition, because of the tensions between a Jewish traditional theological outlook, right, where in terms of, and here I guess I'm really touching on concepts of theodicy and, the a defense of God in light of evil, basically. The Jewish world, I would contend, has not been able to come to some kind of systematic, ritualized understanding of what the Holocaust means within traditional Jewish paradigms. And yet, of course, people have human need to come to terms with an event of the kind of enormity of the Holocaust. So I guess that's a long way of saying that, yes, I do think there is something different. And, depending on what you want to ask next, I could also extend that to even, instances where I think there is actual purposeful theological or theodic content in Holocaust memorial museums, beyond just the personalized ritual that they enable, that they actually, it's inbuilt into those structures.
Well, my next question was going to be along those lines anyway, because from what's sort of coming to me from what you're saying is you use the word tension, but for me, there's sort of this sense of the Holocaust Memorial Museum as a liminal space. It sort of walks the boundary between a secular space and a sacred space, between, a religious space, between a Jewish space, between a non-Jewish space. It sort of walks all of these boundaries, which is very interesting to me. But this idea of it being purposefully built in, tell us about that.
Okay, well, I'll start with a small example that I was actually involved in, so I can speak from personal experience. But what I hope it will illustrate is a sort of larger idea, and then hopefully I'll be able to point towards those larger ideas in other institutions. But as you mentioned in your very kind introduction, the first major exhibition I ever worked on was Culture and Continuity at the Sydney Jewish Museum, and when we were looking at what objects we wanted to display and how we were going to display them, there was one aspect of the exhibition which was a sort of long-term timeline of Jewish history. And of course, we were going to include the Holocaust in that, but we couldn't simply repeat what happened, in the Holocaust displays, which are in the levels above. So we spoke for sort of long and hard about how we're going to do this, and we went to the objects, in a sense, to find our answer. And there was one particular object that is a pretty extraordinary object, and it's we refer to it as the Brojtek Torah. You probably know it quite well, and it's sitting in the ground floor right now. And this is a Torah that was rescued during the Holocaust from a town called Brojtek in the Subcarpathian Mountains, and basically this town was subject to an action during the invasion of the Soviet Union. And the synagogue was burnt, and there were very, very few, like a handful of survivors from this town. What's remarkable is that a non-Jewish resident of the town, when that person saw that the synagogue was indeed burning, went in and saved this Torah. Right, and kept it throughout the war, and then made it their business to find a Jewish survivor after the war and give them this Torah to, in a sense, to have saved something from that town's Jewish life. And Adam Zush was the survivor that this Torah was given to. Now, this Torah was burnt, it was torn, it couldn't be used in a ritualized setting, it couldn't be used in a synagogue. But he didn't want to simply, bury it, put it in a geniza the way that one, in a sense, what one does with damaged sacred text in the Jewish tradition. So he decided to keep it. And Adam migrated to Australia in 1956, when a lot of Hungarian Jewry did, and he kept it. And then as he got older, he started thinking, well, what am I going to do with this Torah? And in the accession records, it says he wished for this object to find a home among the Jews. Right? Now, it's sort of quite an enigmatic phrase. It's quite hard to know what he meant by that, but he donated it to the museum with that intent. So when we were thinking about this Torah, we thought, well, how could we use it in a display? And when you think about it, a Torah like that has so many stories. It could be a story of the action, right, of the invasion of the Soviet Union. It could be a story about that town, right, and pre-war Jewish life. It could tell the story in some ways of Adam's migration, help tell the story of his migration to Australia. But when we saw it, it was almost immediate, actually. We thought, no, this is the object that we're going to use as emblematic in that section of the ground floor display, the long-term Jewish timeline of the rupture of the Holocaust, right? So it became a sort of emblematic, symbolic kind of object. And we were happy, we were sort of happy with that. But then we thought further, and here, in a sense, I'm giving fodder for my own argument, but I hope it illustrates the point that I'm about to try and make, which is we also wanted that object to say something beyond the historical, so to speak, beyond even the symbolic historical level that it was now embedded into the timeline at that point in the display. We wanted it to ask a question, which was, is the Jewish world somehow different? Is Jewish thought different? Is the relationship, the covenantal relationship that the Jews for centuries have believed themselves to be in with God, is this somehow different in the post-war period? Has the Holocaust ruptured something forever? Now, you could say this is a theological question, but it's also just a human question, right, on a certain level. So we framed this object with the following quotation. And this comes from a book by a Melbourne author and academic, Mark Baker. He wrote quite a few years ago now, called The 50th Gate. And in that book, he explored his parents' stories. And it wasn't, what was so intriguing about his book was that he not only wanted to chronicle what they remembered, but he also, in a sense, wanted to question and chronicle what they didn't remember, or what they'd remembered wrongly, right? And what their memories meant to them. So this is an excerpt from that book, and the first half of this excerpt he actually takes from a 2nd century midrash, right? So a midrash that's written at the time at which there is a persecution of those Judeans who had stayed in the land of Israel, and you were publicly, if you publicly tried to teach Torah, you could be put to death by the Roman administration. So the first part is a description of a rabbi who had done just that and his execution by the Romans. So I'll read that part out. Our sages remember Rabbi Hanina ben Teradian was studying the Torah and holding a scroll of the law to his chest. Our enemies took hold of him, wrapped him in the scroll, placed bundles of branches around him, and set them on fire. His disciples called out, Rabbi, what do you see? He answered them, the parchment is burning, but the letters are soaring high above me. So in other words, what is Ben Teradian saying? He's saying, don't read history like a Roman, right, to his students. And he's saying, you see the end of history here, but what I'm telling you is there's a meta history. There's another story that we are a part of, and that is going to survive past this, and it's going to do so through the holy text and through our ability to allow that text to live beyond, in a sense, these physical earthly circumstances, right? And what Rabbi Ben Teradion is actually saying there is a classical Jewish theodicy, right? That theodicy is you see evil in the world, but I'm telling you that ultimately it is for the good, right? And that the covenant will continue. We will still stay in connection with our God throughout this. Then Mark adds the following at the end, and this is his writing. My parents remember the fire, the parchment burning, the bodies buried, letters soaring high, turned to ash and dust. And I think my interpretation, right, and why I wanted to use this, obviously, for the burnt Torah that we had in the display, is our question is, well, is it now the same? Right? Can we simply say, well, it's not simple, but can we revert to those classical theodicies and say, we don't understand, but ultimately this must be something that will turn toward the good, right? Now, not only can we not say that, but for modern Jewry, that is almost an impossibility. It's not, by the way, for traditional Jewry, right? You will find in ultra-Orthodox or very traditional thought the same theodicies that applied to traumatic events prior to the Holocaust will also apply to the Holocaust. But I'm talking about the majority of Jews that emerge after the Second World War for whom these classical theodicies are unpalatable, right? 1.1 million Jewish children. How can we say this is ultimately toward the good? And that's what I think Mark's question is, right? Is, are we still able to say that as Jews, as humans in a post-Holocaust universe? So to frame that object, right, within that kind of idea, to me, is to bring in questions into the museum space that are not simply historical questions. They are what I would call meta-historical questions. They're questions of meaning, right? They're questions of, what does this history mean to us today? How do we understand it? What does it mean for our lives? And if you think about the majority of Holocaust museums today, these are the questions they ask. And I think we've become sort of so used to it that we don't see that this is actually quite a radical reworking of in a sense, the purpose of history, right? Like why we tell history. In these museums, we don't simply tell history to have a historical record. I mean, of course they do. And the major Holocaust museums in the world today, Washington, Yad Vashem, they're extraordinary institutes of historical research as well. But they also, and if you look at, one of the things I was very privileged to look at as part of my research were the founding documents of the Washington Museum, and the council that was put together of really, it was just, it reads like the luminaries of Jewish thought in the late 1970s. So the council that was put together, or the commission, to report to Jimmy Carter on whether such an institution should be built, and you look at their reasonings for why this place should be built, the minority is to record the history. The majority are things like, to transform the living by transmitting the legacy of the dead. right? To honor and commemorate the dead, to show the world that we should live in a different way. I'm paraphrasing now, but transformative aspirations, right, were what were built into the desire to build these places. So what I guess I'm trying to say is when I talk about in my own work, in my own book, I talk about these places as built theodicies. Now, what do I mean by that? I don't actually mean they are theistic, right? They're not trying to bring people into a particular faith, but they are asking questions. In almost secularized versions, although of course they're peppered throughout with allusions to the Bible, and you look at all these places have these kinds of allusions, and they transform traditional Jewish symbols, etc., etc. But in essence, they're asking the same questions, which is, what is the meaning of this event? How do we continue living in light of this event? Is it possible for the Jews to still consider themselves a covenantal people in light of this event? These are all questions, I think, that are still embedded in these places. And in many ways, these are the places where you can ask these questions because, to be honest, to ask these questions, I think, in a traditional, synagogue setting is not, it can't be in many ways, right? I mean, and I'll give you one example of that, and then I'll stop because I think I've probably gone way over the topic that you actually asked me. But if you think about it, one of the most radical responses in post-Holocaust theology was Richard Rubenstein, who I think it was in the 1960s, responded to a commentary survey where they asked 50 great Jewish thinkers at the time to respond to the pressing questions in Jewish life, and one of them was what is the state of Jewish belief after the Holocaust? And he was the only one out of 50 thinkers, right, who said not that God was dead. He said, we cannot know that. It wasn't a sort of God is dead kind of response, but it was, look, the covenant is broken. Like if you really look at Auschwitz, if you actually don't turn away from what happened at Auschwitz, you cannot say that the Jewish covenant still exists in its traditional form. Now, Rubenstein never worked again as a congregational rabbi, right? As a result, in many ways, he spent his life as an academic. I think in many ways he wanted to remain an academic as well, but still. And, in many ways, his challenge, I guess, or was not taken up by other thinkers. There are modifications on it. There are theories, but post-Holocaust theologies like Rabbi Irving Greenberg's idea of voluntary covenant, that the Jews must choose the covenant after the Holocaust. But to literally say the covenant is broken is not something that is easily reconciled with Jewish thought. But the experience of post-Holocaust Jewry is certainly one in which those questions, in a sense, must be addressed. Right? There must be a way to address and perhaps to continue in Jewish life, but in a universe where those traditional paradigms are just not satisfactory anymore.
The interesting thing about this idea of, asking the questions in a museum space is, I don't know if you would agree with me, but I feel like in Holocaust memorial museums, one of the most sacred things that happens around this idea of asking the question, even if they are an aporia, even if they are fundamentally unanswerable, is there's this sacrality around the concept of education, around educating Jews and non-Jews alike about these questions and asking these questions and hopefully getting some answers to create a better world. I mean, you look at Yad Vashem, at USHMM, at the Sydney Jewish Museum, the numbers of students that come through those museums is off the charts. And I mean, I think both you and I would say if you ask survivors in those spaces why they come, why they volunteer, why they share their story, they are so focused on that sacred act of education and of getting people to face these questions for a better world. I was just wondering if we could finish off by you talking about the concept of education in these spaces and whether you agree that it's a sacred act.
Yeah, I absolutely do for a couple of reasons. One is that, again, in all the survivors that I spoke to, that was such a strong, as you said, such a strong feeling that I do this because in coming here and telling this story and commemorating this event, I am hopefully educating and making some kind of change for the future. Right. So I think there's just in that way, that's a sort of self-evident, reason as to why I would absolutely agree with your observation. The other one is a bit more interpretive. I'll put it. I will say it's interpretive of me to say this, but I do think, and I don't want to be chauvinistic about this. This exists in other traditions as well, but for the Jewish tradition, the act of study is sacred. It's holy, right? To study, to transmit knowledge, traditionally through Torah study, but of course through the oral Torah as well, is a sacred act, right? So this is something I think that in many ways it's a natural thing for institutions that are going to be so intimately involved with Jewish tradition and Jewish communities, that this is again a sort of secularized version of this, right? It's a way that we can deploy the tradition through ostensibly a secular framework, but it still fulfills very much a traditional function. So yes, I would say that is absolutely the case, and I think what's really interesting, of course, and this happened with Anzac, and it's happened with other historical events as well, is that as we grow further away, so the interest grows. Like when I first started at the museum, one of the greatest fears of the survivors was that who will remember this, and when we're gone, and as that survivor community has aged, there has been more interest, right, rather than less. As you say, the Sydney Jewish Museum can barely fit everyone in who would like to come, and who would like to learn. And that's one of the challenges of Holocaust education at the moment. How do we do it well, and how do we do it for the amount of people that want to know? Which I have to say, I think is it's a terrific development, and a credit to those places that they have been able to generate that kind of interest.
And you only have to look around at the news at the moment at the amount of Holocaust survivors that have been interviewed about coronavirus. I mean, the idea that that we have to learn their knowledge and their wisdom is something that is, clearly applied to everything if we actually have a look at the news. Now, Avril, I just want to thank you for being with us today. I want to give another shout out to your most recent book, Holocaust Memory and Racism in the Post-War World, from Wayne State University Press. But yeah, thank you again, Avril, for joining.
Pleasure. Thank you, Breann.
I'm really thankful that my co-editor, Breann Fallon, who interviewed today's guest, Dr. Avril Alba, had the opportunity to, as an experienced museum educator herself, really speak about some of the roles that museums play in curating history, but also the active roles that they play in shaping our understanding of history and the way in which the public interacts with history. I'm thinking particularly about some of the questions, and Dr. Alba calls them maybe even meta-historical questions that are about the meaning of history for us today in each era. Bree and I are speaking in a very tense moment right now in the United States, but for a Holocaust museum, that memory of traumatic pasts is very much alive today. And I'd love to hear a little bit more from you, Bree, about that idea of the purpose of memory and meaning making in museums.
Well, if I speak for our own museum, I think history is definitely something that is very much alive. It's very much something that has a voice. And when we hear from Holocaust survivors, it's that very conscious learning from the past and ensuring that we're not just recording history, that we are learning from it, that we are asking greater questions from it. I mean, Avril Alba talked about the concept of the meta-narrative and even the questions of theodicy about the amount of children that were lost in the Holocaust, and how do we make sense of that? And museums have such an important cultural role to play because in recording our past and recording our memories, they're really sort of showing us and holding a mirror up to us in terms of where we've been and where we want to go. And in the present moment, we're recording this on, in early June, and in the present moment with what is going on in the US, I can't help but thinking of the new lynching museum. I believe it's in Montgomery, and the fact that museum has these large plinths, which are from different areas around the South, that have names of individuals that were lynched, and each town is supposed to come and collect that plinth, and only a handful of them have been collected, and that is a really great example of how that museum is trying to make that connection between the past and the present and really highlight the fact that there is a lot of work to do. There are a lot of questions that are still unanswered and a lot of questions that haven't actually been asked. And in the present moment, I can't help but think about the museum's role in really, as I said, holding up that mirror to us and helping us think about what hasn't been changed and what needs to be changed going forward. And, we're here on the Religious Studies Project, and religion is a fundamental part of that. Religion as an institution, religion as an idea is something that is present throughout human society, and we need to think about what role that has had in the past, what role that has in the present, and what role religion is going to have in the future as we try and answer those questions and try and keep asking questions about what's gone on in the past. That was a very long explanation for the question you asked me, Dave, and I think we're going to keep talking about these questions in the next episode that we'll have coming up next week.
We are. And for those of you that would like to learn more about the museum's name is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, also known as the Legacy Museum. And it traces the lives and the experiences of Black people who were enslaved in Montgomery, Alabama, and other places, from enslavement to mass incarceration. It is an award-winning museum that has been very, very well received and is something that's definitely on my list to do, to explore the American history of racial injustice and its legacy to this day, even this past week and these past years, as we, as a nation, deal with the death of George Floyd. And next time, we hope that in discourse, that there's an opportunity to talk about some of the critical theoretical approaches that scholars that we're familiar with can bring to bear at the intersection of this time with coronavirus and protests about police actions in the U.S. And so until then, I think we're really fortunate to have an opportunity to share with you some of these perspectives and to look forward to future conversations about critical theory on religion and how all of our scholarly work can really be brought to enhance and improve the lives of all the people that that could be listening and that are out there that we would love to be able to reach. Wouldn't you agree, Bree?
Yes, 100%. But we will bring together, that critical side of religious studies and how our work can make a difference in that next episode. So until then, all that's left to say is thanks for listening.
The RSP is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The Religious Studies Project is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SC047750.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Marek Sullivan and Rebecca Barrett-Fox, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bach. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio editing by Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop, and video editing by Jonathan Tuckett.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our amazon.com, .co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs, and you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.